I'm very glad to welcome you all to the first proper exhibition at the DTC campus, photographs of Yasser Alwan. This is, we hope, part of an ongoing project to do with Arab photography, and we hope to have a series of exhibitions over the coming years, building up towards possibly larger venues and larger exhibitions in 2 or 3 years' time. I hope some of you have had a chance to look around the exhibition. The exhibition will be up till December the 15th, I think. So there's plenty of time to come back and look around. There are 91 images in every nook and corner of the DTC right now, even in some rooms. And really, if you have a chance, you should explore as much as possible by looking around on both sides of the campus. I just want to say a few words about Yasser, and then we're going to have a brief conversation, I think, to introduce his work. And I think the format we would like is really to open it for general discussion so that you get a chance to talk to Yasser and so on. Before we open it up and before we begin the conversation proper, we're going to show a video that Yasser has made about 10 minutes long called Surah, which is up there. Which will also help introduce his work, we hope. I've known Yasser for, I don't know, well over a decade. We met in the mid to late 1990s in Egypt. And my first encounter with Yasser was a bit like yours, I hope, through his photographs. They were hanging in a friend's house, and I was very moved and very impressed by them. And we met soon thereafter and have remained friends ever since. And although my students are sitting here, the one thing I emphasize to them always is not to confuse the author with the work that they're studying. In this case, I have to admit, one of the great pleasures of knowing Yasser is how closely his personality and moral sensibility fits the very pictures he makes. And if you have some sense of the pictures, I think you will also get some sense of that. I got to know Yasser around the time that I was moving my own research interests into photography, away from literature and intellectual history. And just today, Yasser was looking through my photography book collection in my apartment and saying how many books there were that he would like to read. And although that collection has almost grown parallel to our friendship, I have to say I've actually learned far more about what really, really matters in photography from talking to Yasser over the last 15 years or so than from any of those books, by far, and by looking at his photographs. So it's a special pleasure for me to have Yasser here. Yasser grew up in the United States and studied in the United States, and then as a young man, when traveling in the Middle East, traveled through Yemen, Jordan, and other countries, and I believe in the mid-1980s, ended up in Cairo taking pictures and has settled there and has been there ever since. So although many of the pictures in the exhibition are from various parts of the Arab world, the vast majority are from Egypt, and the vast majority of those from the streets of Cairo in particular. There have been various projects, including street workers, people at racetracks, people at bus stations, and there are ongoing projects involving the Coptic Christian community. There are some pictures around the campus, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. So I think without saying much more, I'm hoping more of the information will just come out in conversation. We'd like to show you the 10-minute video first. كده عايزين صورة صورة صورة
صورة تحت الراية المنصورة، صورة 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 كلنا كده عايزين صورة، صورة 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 تحت الراية المنصورة.
Surah allows everyone to squeeze into the national portrait of Egypt. No one is left out. It's a song about hope and inspired leadership, about looking and moving forward toward a better future, about no one being left behind. That's why this pre-1967 song became the anthem of this year's revolution, because it reflects an era when every single Egyptian was proud to be part of this country, as Gamal Abdel Nasser is about to tell us.
الفلاحين والعمال والجنود والمثقفين، إن وحدته وتماسكه والتفاعل الخلاق داخل إطار هذه الوحدة قادر على أن يصنع بالعمل وبالعمل الجاد وبالعمل الشاق، كما قلت أكثر من مرة، معجزات ضخمة في هذا البلد.
But Nasser's miracles never materialized. In actuality, the peasants, laborers, and bureaucrats that he speaks about with such conviction have been so battered by oppression and poverty and humiliation that photographing people in public often turned into an exercise in self-defense. Accusations of distorting Egypt's image would fly like the bricks and stones that rained on Tahrir during the worst moments of the demonstrations. But January 25 transformed an entire people's self-image. It made Egyptians feel proud again, precisely because the revolution achieved the impossible. In the people's heart of hearts, their revolution made things right again.
لا بد للشعب أن يحصل على حقه بالثورة طالما هو يعاني الضغط والكبت، وطالما هو يعاني من الرجعية التي تسلب الأموال والتي تسلب عمل الشعب.
قالوا الشقيق بيمص دم الشقيق، والناس ما هيش ناس بحق وحقيق. قالوا الشقيق بيمص دم الشقيق، والناس ما هيش ناس بحق وحقيق. قلبي رميته وجبت غيره حجر، ده بالحجر ورجعت قلبي رقيق. عجبي
أن الثورة ستحرر الأجراء من سيطرة رأس المال واستغلاله. الثورة ستعمل من أجل الشعب كله. الثورة ستحول الأجراء إلى ملاك غير مستغلين، أو ترفع عن الأجراء الظلم والاستغلال. الثورة ستعمل على إعادة البناء الاجتماعي لصالح الشعب كله، لصالح الأمة كلها، لا لصالح طبقة من الطبقات وحدها. الثورة ستعمل على حل مشاكل الصراع الطبقي لصالح الطبقة المظلومة والعاملة، لتحررها من الظلم ولتحررها من الاستغلال.
ياللي انت بيتك قش مفروش بريش، تقوى عليه الريح يصبح مفيش. ياللي انت بيتك قش مفروش بريش، تقوى عليه الريح يصبح مفيش. عجبي عليه حواليه مخالب كبار، وملكش غير منقار وقادر تعيش. عجب.
You've been listening to the two most renowned voices of Egypt's first revolution, its poet and politician. Gamal Abdel Nasser's rhetoric about how the revolution would change the social structure of Egypt, about how it would foster social justice and defend workers' rights from the deprivations of capital, were principles that Salah Jahin believed in. He wrote Surah and other songs with these convictions in mind. But his personal poetry, especially the ruba'iyat that you've been listening to, reveal a more nuanced side to his insights. Simultaneously light-hearted and grave, affectionate and philosophical, witty and bleak, Salah Jahin commented on his Egypt with the clarity of a poet whose perceptions and inspirations ultimately reveal the hollowness of Nasser's inspiring rhetoric.
الفقراء ليهم الجنة، والفقراء دول ما لهمش نصيب في الدنيا، نصيبهم بس في الآخرة. هم عايزين أيضا نصيب صغير في الدنيا ويديكوا قصاده نصيب في الجنة.
أنا شاب لكن عمري ولا 1000 عام، وحيد ولكن بين ضلوعي زحام. أنا شاب لكن عمري ولا 1000 عام، وحيد ولكن بين ضلوعي زحام. خايف ولكن خوفي مني أنا أخرس، ولكن قلبي مليان كلام عجبي.
This is the face of the men, women, and children who inherited the 1952 revolution. A revolution that was meant to establish justice, freedom, and dignity for the people of Egypt eventually became a replica of the colonial monarchy it removed, only more ruthless and more corrupt. This is also the face of the January 25th revolution. It's the face of a people who had reached the breaking point and who roared and cried and laughed their oppressors away. If the people of Egypt don't slip back into their dumb silence again, then maybe January 25 will not turn out to be like July 26.
يا عندليب ما تخافش من غنوتك، قول شكوتك واحكي على بلوتك. الغنوة مش هتموتك، إنما كتم الغنى هو اللي هيموتك.
المجتمع اللي كان كل واحد مننا بيحلم بيه وبيفكر فيه لازم هنخططه ونرسمه ونبنيه وفق مشيئتنا.
Thank you. So before we get entirely intellectual, I just left out one very practical and important piece of information, that pictures are for sale. In case anyone's interested. I thought we might begin by talking a little bit about Surah. if I remember correctly, there's only one photograph actually from Tahrir Square. It's the group picture of the men early on. But almost your entire body of work in some ways has been reframed by Tahrir Square and what happened. I just wanted to get you to talk a little bit about that in terms of whether there's a sense that you've always had with the project, that's what it's been about, or whether this is a kind of rethinking of the project in the light of what's been happening.
Can I say a few words about this first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Surah is the word for picture in Arabic. And we say surah photographiya to say photograph. And then you would see the magazine cover immediately after the opening, which is a magazine called The Subjects That Are Photographed. And this song became the most important song repeated in Tahrir Square, in Alexandria, and Suez, wherever there were long-term demonstrations in Egypt. That's part of the motivation for making this video. What I did is to interweave some of the most well-known voices in Egypt. You heard Gamal Abdel Nasser, the first president after the revolution, who was also an incredible speaker. And the song Surah and the poetry that you heard was written by Salah Jahin, Egypt's most important poet in the 20th century, and he's written all kinds of stuff. And the two singers who were singing the song and the poetry are also incredibly important. And what I wanted to do was interweave my images with these voices, partly because there's a subtext to this that would be hard for you to get because of the language, but also partly because I wanted to use these incredibly famous and emotionally powerful voices for Egyptians and mix my photographs with them, because often in Egypt people don't like my work. And so I used the events of January and February to recontextualize my work for people in Egypt.
I'm interested in this. You've said this to me a couple of times before, and I believe you haven't had an exhibition in Egypt itself.
Oh, I did. It got such terrible reviews 10 years ago that I just decided not to have any more exhibitions after that. It was the foreigner who came to Egypt to make fun of the Egyptian people, to photograph all the things that we don't want people to see. And the interesting thing is that there's an entire new space that's been opened up ever since the events of January and February. All of a sudden people are happy and proud of themselves. And the context that I've been working in and the people that I've been photographing are often not feeling that way about their own lives. And that's what makes portraiture, especially street portraiture, which is what I do, extremely difficult in Egypt.
You say that there has been this reaction to the photographs in Egypt. To what extent is that a class-based reaction? I mean, are we talking about the people whose pictures you've actually taken, or the people who go to the galleries?
Both. Both. There's definitely a class-based thing. I presented my work in London, and the Egyptians said, "Wow, why aren't you showing the better things about Egypt?" But also the people themselves, whom I photograph, and it's quite a long process to convince people to be photographed. Oftentimes, the people I'm photographing sort of are bearing the burden of society on their shoulders, and they often feel like they're sinking. And these are people who don't want the particulars of their lives documented, Shamoon. They don't feel like they're on top of the world, they feel like they're at the bottom. Why would they want that documented? And part of my work is to show these people who, something about themselves through my eyes, or allow them a chance to present themselves. And that's a lot of work.
One of the things that's striking about the images for me is that to some extent the way you contextualized it in the video and some of the ways you've spoken about it, for instance, when you come to my classes with the students and so on, tends to emphasize the social and historical context. There's a lot of information about the nature of the labor, the economic conditions, and so on. So that the spoken discourse is very familiar from a certain documentary tradition. But the photographs don't necessarily fit that tradition. In the sense, if you think of the 1930s or 40s in America, there's a particular kind of photography. At a casual glance, some of the pictures might look like that, but they're fundamentally not like that. And I wanted you to speak a bit about that, if you could.
It's getting hot in here. I was talking about this in Shamoon's class earlier. Yeah, I work in this tradition, but there's also a tradition of seeing people from this part of the world, and that tradition, let's say, has been what I've sort of tried to articulate just to myself as a sort of one-way seeing. Oftentimes being people from Europe or the United States coming to this part of the world and making images. And the people who are in those images are not taking part in those images the way I would like people to sort of participate in the work that I do. And that differentiates a bit my work from, let's say, earlier traditions of photography. I'm also interested in the portrait, just the portrait. That means portraiture before the invention of photography. I don't know this, there are art historians here who would know this better, but from my little knowledge of art history, it's not the kinds of people you would see in my portraits who were the subjects of portraiture throughout history. Photography allowed that to happen, in fact. But if you look at the history of Egypt, you will not really find this social class presenting itself. You will find this social class represented in a certain way. And part of my work is to say, use the people of Egypt, not use the people, but have the people of Egypt represent other peoples and allow themselves to present how they feel about themselves and how they feel about me to the rest of the world through the way we work together.
You and I went to the new exhibition at Saadiyat Island just a couple of days ago, which I think there's an exhibition currently opening at Saadiyat called Emirati Expressions, which is a group show of contemporary Emirati photographers or people working in the photographic medium. And it struck me that there were no human faces almost in the entire exhibition. It's quite abstract, or shop fronts or doorways or objects. And there's a style there which seems to me increasingly prevalent in the Western and the non-Western context. And I'm again curious about your kind of unflinching commitment to a certain, what many people would consider an almost outmoded humanist tradition. It seems to me much easier to place this in a certain kind of, well-known tradition of people like Cartier-Bresson, Walker Evans, or Dorothea Lange. Can you say a bit more about the Arab traditions of photography? Because I think that's a history that's very little known, and the variety of it is very little known currently.
The earliest photography that was done in the Arab world by people who were living in the Arab world was done by Armenians, people who learned trade from European photographers who came and photographed, who often left their equipment in Egypt or in other countries in the Arab world. And I've met the earliest photographer in Jordan, for example, and inevitably the oldest studio photographers in Cairo or Armenian. Photography sort of came to its own as an art form sometime in the 1970s in Europe and the United States, started taking off and started involving itself in all the other arts, and other artists started using photography within their field. There's no, as far as I know, sort of documentary tradition in this part of the world. There are lots of studio photographers, but no documentary tradition. And I would say we don't know who the Arab peoples are visually. That's one thing I'm trying to do for Egypt.
But I know that you've been collecting in flea markets and shops and so on, a kind of a vernacular tradition of Egyptian photography.
Yes, there's the studio tradition where you went, and of course, since you controlled the picture, since you were paying for it, you got photographed the way you wanted to. But then these are also sort of, they're documentary in one sense, and pretend pictures in another, like mine are. But as young Arab photographers began to work, photography was moving radically away from the kind of work that I do. And you will find very few Arab photographers working the way I do. I can't think of enough for a handful. And unfortunately, what I see is that Arab photography, or young Arab photographers, are often mimicking a fashionable kind of art photography that's become prevalent in the big galleries in Europe and the United States. That's not to say that the work is of poor quality, but there is an interesting relationship there. And my emotional structure is such that this is the work that I do. I'm not interested in the other work.
I mean, I'd like to open up to questions very soon, but I wanted to get you to just talk about two broad areas to, I think, contextualize some of the work a little bit. I think people may not have a particularly accurate sense of the difficulties of photographing in Egypt, because there's a way in which street photography is taken for granted within a certain Western tradition or American European tradition, and I know that this has been a very complicated process for you, and I think it would be useful if you could say a bit about that.
It's a very rough neighborhood, Cairo, in the sense that if you want to do what I do, people generally react quite badly to it. The refrain I hear all the time is, go take pictures of the pyramids. Well, everybody takes pictures of the pyramids, right? This idea of doing, let's say, portraiture or documentary work or street photography isn't part of the culture. You're in a neighborhood that's not the most well-off neighborhood. Already people will see you as, hey, what are you doing? You're an outsider in this neighborhood. You've already got that tension to deal with. You have to reduce that tension. You also have an incredibly repressive police state that doesn't want images like this to be made. The previous regime had a vested interest in controlling the kind of images that were made. And you must understand the power that this state has over controlling images, and also the institution of tourism. They're both interested in making sure that a certain kind of image leaves Egypt. And that's not the images that I make. And I've had to deal with the police and state security and being followed and all these other obstacles, and also people reacting very badly to what I do by claiming that I'm a spy, by claiming that I'm out to scandalize Egypt because I'm photographing in, not the not the Abu Dhabi looking like neighborhoods, but I'm photographing in the neighborhoods that, you know, that give Egypt a bad name. And so there's this one-to-one relationship between poverty and bad that my work is trying to dispel.
I'm assuming that part of the difficulty involved is gender related. So I think as you walk around the exhibitions, it's clear that the vast majority of the pictures are of men, with especially middle class exceptions, but not very few working class exceptions. Is that?
Boy, you can get into serious trouble if you try to photograph women on the street. Yes, and that's unfortunately sort of, let's say, an invisibility that my work reproduces. Working women are just as common as working men, and yet for me to photograph them has been so complicated and so difficult that I now just shy away from it. Now I'm 3 times more careful when I would approach a woman with a camera, and then 10 times more careful before I would sort of engage that person in trying to make a portrait than I would a man. It's super difficult, and it's something I'm dying to do. I've tried to work with women's organizations who work in neighborhoods and so on and so forth, but I haven't had much success at that.
In the video, there is a song that sings that I'm a young man, but I'm 1,000 years old. What does that mean?
What does that mean? Well, you've got to interpret Salat Shaheen for yourself. I was just trying to translate it. I would take it to mean something like, this is an incredibly old and rich culture, and that this culture is part of the people as they grow up.
You said that sometimes your subjects take some persuasion to be photographed. My 2 questions related to that. What ultimately persuades them, and how do your subjects ultimately benefit from being photographed?
I would argue that they don't benefit at all. Maybe, oftentimes they get a photograph or 2. How do I convince them? I guess I'm charming. I'm certainly incredibly curious about them and their work and their labor and what makes them tick. What is it that makes the ordinary person tick? How would you tick if you lived in a country where there was absolutely no way for you to get ahead in life the way we imagine getting ahead? None. No matter what you did. But such is life as it is presented to you. I'm completely curious about this. And how Egyptians managed to live so incredibly well in such an incredibly overcrowded, I think Egypt is the most overcrowded agricultural country in the world. This is the question I've been asking myself ever since I went to Egypt.
I wondered if you could expand a little bit on how you see your portraits as different from, for instance, the portraits of the migrants during the Great Depression in the US. For me, many of these just seem very similar, particularly the woman who is looking very pensive in perhaps her kitchen, perhaps her home.
Wow. I don't have an answer for it, to be honest. If something comes out of the interaction between me and the people I'm photographing, Bertie, then that's sort of a successful photograph. But what makes them different, that's Shamoon's job to articulate that kind of thing.
I actually do think that they're very, very different. I mean, I tried to ask the same question earlier, and it's very awkward to sit next to Yasser and try and, we've been doing this in class where I disagree with what he says about his own photographs sometimes. But, it seems to me that if you look at a lot of the Great Depression photographs, there's far more contextual information on economic and social conditions. And although it's peripherally there in Yasser's pictures, I think I'm just fascinated by the fact that quite literally that sense of depression isn't really there, although they're very dark pictures in some ways. I mean, there's a focusing in on the human face and only the human face in a way that I think the range of photographs made in the 1930s tend not to do, even in the work of Lang or Bork White or Walker Evans. You'll see dilapidated houses, and you'll see people working in the fields who are medium or long shot. I mean, I think the aesthetic is, that's why I said, I think the phrase I used was that at a casual glance, I think some of these pictures look like that, but the more you look at them, there's something profoundly different going on.
Can I ask perhaps 3 questions? They all relate to the images that I saw this afternoon here in the exhibition. The first question is, one image showed a younger man with a lot of cloth or perhaps leather on his shoulders, standing like that. And I couldn't avoid being struck with what I seem to remember images of James Dean. So one question is, if you work perhaps sometimes consciously with, let's say, certain strategies of association. The second question is, I was struck by the fact that quite a few images, indeed with their focus on the face, show something very particular with regard to the eyes. It's not that they look away, but they look over and above what seems to be your eyes through the camera, or rather the camera eye, if you will. And it makes them almost as if they avoid the gaze of the camera. And that relates to the third question. There's one particular image, I think of an old man that, with his wrinkles in his face, in his deep curves in his cheeks, seems to very much smile at you, but so that implies again of an engaging actor, if you will, with the observer. But then the way you print the image, I'm not sure if it was kind of a rough pixels or larger pixels, or whether it was the grayness of the painting, of the photograph, almost as if you were building into the image a kind of a screen that somehow prevents or plays with direct observation.
James Dean?
Okay, Reinder, no, I didn't think about James Dean. Not consciously. I use a funny camera. Part of the reason that I have been able to get close to people is because I started using this quote-unquote funny camera. I used to work with a 35mm camera, and some of the 35mm images are up there, but the camera comes between me and the people. And I started using a waist-level camera, so that the camera is at sort of my waist and I'm looking down, but I also look directly at the people, and they're often engaging my eyes rather than the camera eye. But that allowed me to come closer than a 35mm camera. The last question, I have to tell you that I didn't see the prints until I arrived last week, and I'm extremely happy with every single print except for 2. But I'm not used to looking at images on the screen. I'm used to looking at prints in my hand, and I didn't have them before I came. it came out like this because the man at the studio in New York is really perceptive. But that's his work.
Well, I just wanted to say that I thought these were haunting, how do you say, images that made a great impression on me. So I was just trying to express my amazement and wonder and admiration about the effect that you've achieved.
Well, thank you.
I think one of the things we haven't talked about is that you do work with film, not digital, and you work with a large format or medium large format, 6x6. Do you want to say a bit about that? Because it seems to me that also creates a different sense of time in terms of composition and speed of composition and the number of compositions you can undertake.
Well, I have to work more slowly than people who work in digital. And then the 6x6 is a bit more cumbersome than a 35mm camera, so it takes a bit more time. It takes more engagement to make a negative. I have to slow down. And one thing you'll notice, I think, in even the 35mm photographs, that I'm not so interested in this Cartier-Bresson instantaneous moment. Cartier-Bresson is an amazing photographer who's taught me quite a bit, but it's not the way I work. I'm interested in some sort of interaction and a state rather than a momentary, instantaneous slice of time. That's why I've also paired the images so that that feeling comes across. Of course, film goes over the heads of anybody who's 25 and younger. And people are asking at Tahrir Square, people are saying, I want to see the picture. And I have to go through this 3-minute long explanation of, hey, this is film, and I take it out and I show it to them. So I sort of become a dinosaur. There are some photographers still working in film. But it's an incredibly expressive and sensual medium in comparison to digital. I'm still not used to seeing images on the screen. Because I grew up with, paper prints in my hand.
I was wondering, the photographs in the exhibition are taken over quite a long span of time. Do you feel like they've changed through that period of time as your style changed or who you're interested in photographing?
Sure. The world that I live in sort of has become part of me and has changed me. When I first went to Egypt in 1986, I had no idea I'd stay. So I was making photographs for an audience back in the United States. I made surah for Egyptians. The real version is the Arabic version. And I can't see, yes, my style has changed. Of course, I moved from one format to another. That automatically imposed its own changes on me. My concerns have also changed over time. What makes people tick in the situations that most people in this part of the world have to live in is the key thing. That wasn't the exact focus of my work when I first came. And can I just mention one more thing about surah? Because the voices are in Arabic, except for my own, the language was incredibly important in this tiny little film. I wanted Egyptians to hear their favorite vernacular poet, but I also wanted them to hear the language that Abdel Nasser was using and to make comparisons between that language and the language of the military dictatorship, who were the inheritors of the Abdel Nasser regime, and they've been using the same language. And I didn't make that overt at all. I just hope people would pick that up somehow.
After looking at all of his pictures, I realized that some of your pictures, all of your pictures have something in common. So what I mean by this is, like, if I see this picture or the photographs later, I can tell, okay, this one is taken by him. I think one of the reasons is because all of the pictures, or most of the pictures except few in Sudan, are taken in like Cairo, and like Cairo or the Egypt is like a really big theme, or actually, yeah, it's, I think all the photographs are kind of revolved around people in Cairo and people in Egypt. So I was wondering, have you ever considered like taking photographs like outside Egypt, outside Cairo, or if yes, which like country or like which location would be, and if no, what is the thing that like really captures you or like sticks you, I mean like, you know, roots you in yourself in Cairo?
Cairo is one of the most amazing cities I've ever seen in my entire life. It's 20 million people, it's hard to imagine here. So it's many countries and many worlds, and I think if I spent my entire lifetime just photographing Cairo, I wouldn't be done. I don't think any one photographer could do that. I am now trying to photograph in other parts of Egypt, but because I work slowly. You know, you're looking at 25 years of work. I'm slow, and it's harder to get out, and I have a family and practical concerns. But right now I'm working on a project that may get me to every nook and cranny of Egypt, and I'm fascinated with the rest of the country. But Cairo has such an enormous emotional pull because it's just this kaleidoscope. You know, oftentimes people who come to Cairo, their initial reaction is not very positive because of all the things that, you know, immediately hit you in the face. But it's this 20 million people are living in this relatively tiny space, and they're negotiating with one another extremely well, considering the conditions that people have to live in. I'm not just talking about economic conditions, I'm also talking about, you know, the terrible repression that people suffer. And that sense of shared community is what keeps people going. I think that's also true in the rest of the country, and I'm hoping that in the next year or two I'll be discovering that with this new project.
You said it takes a lot of time and effort to convince your subjects. So once you've made a successful photograph, do you keep in touch with your subjects, or do they ask anything from you? Because
oh, well, people are asking things from me all the time. How can I get to the United States? And I need some, you know, as if I have some secret thing. Yes, people ask for money. People are willing to be photographed if I give them money. Of course, that immediately destroys any kind of relationship. It begins this way because people perceive me as being, well, here's a guy with nothing better to do than walk around town taking pictures. He doesn't have to work. And you have to understand from their point of view that's absolutely accurate.
so how do you respond to their...
What I do is I try to return pictures to people. Whether I continue photographing them or not is irrelevant, but that's one thing I do to break the cycle of my only looking at them. And I've become friends with some people. And I think I was telling Shamoon's class that one of the people I photographed was in Tahrir Square. Said, hey, I know you. You took my picture 10 years ago. I've also kept in touch with some of the photographs that I made in 1986, and these families have become a part of my life.
Shamoon has talked about thinking of your work in terms of traditions of Arab photography. But when I first came to Abu Dhabi, one of the things that struck me was the very public portraiture of the country's leaders that is everywhere, much more evident here than you would see, for example, in New York. And I'm wondering if there's a tradition of Arab portraiture or to which your work might be said to respond, or that might help us understand something that's going on in your work.
Cyrus, in every shop that you would walk into Cairo, if it's owned by a person, you will find a portrait. Every shop. Of course, on the front cover of Al-Ahram, Egypt's most important, largest newspaper, there was a photograph of Mubarak every single day. These are stylized images. They don't reveal much about the person. They reveal much about an image that people want to present. But this is the tradition I know, except for the person who mentioned, this photographer whose work I don't know at all. But it's a stylized image. It's an image about social class. I think it was Kierkegaard who said something about 19th century photography, saying that all of a sudden, all the working class and the peasantry could have their images made. All of a sudden, ever since this technology. Actually, I think photography is a sort of shift in consciousness or something like this. And he said something that all of these images could really be summarized into one photograph. Everybody putting on someone else's clothes and holding on to the Bible and pretending to look off into space like Caesar and wanting to be someone else. The images you would see in the shops around Cairo are very much like this. You can see the portrait, and sometimes you see the person sitting there who owns the shop or runs the shop, and there's a huge discrepancy. But you have to have that portrait.
And on the walls, a picture of someone's picture being made.
Yes.
And that picture seems like it would be very much the kind of picture you're describing that you would then find in a shop, where the guy is just sitting like that and very immobile and very inexpressive, really, because something proper has to be done. And so I was wondering whether that was indeed sort of an ironical clue to the contrast of the kind of picture you're making. He's actually the only character in that whole collection that does not look at you. And in fact, I think I was struck by the reverse of what Reindert was saying, namely how much communication with you there is in these pictures. That those faces, what I found important, most important in those pictures was the face and especially the eyes, and then the hands and the feet. They are extraordinarily, strikingly expressive hands and feet. But the eyes communicate with you. So it's all the more surprising that you tell us, it was difficult to get these people to accept that I did their picture, because it seems that in the end, it is a collaborative work. They all say something to you. So how did you obtain that? I guess, you've said something to that already by saying I talked to them and so on. But still, it's very surprising. They do give the sense that they felt they were doing something in this. Is that right?
Yes. The picture you mentioned, it's three people, two people, one person with a camera, one person being photographed, one person sort of holding a dark cloth. Yes? This used to be my favorite photograph for a very long time. This was one of the Egyptian adaptations of photography, and he wasn't going to have his photograph in a shop, the person who was seated. And if you noticed, his hands are not in the jacket because he doesn't own the jacket. That was going to be some kind of mugshot for some bureaucratic process that he had to go through. And this camera is an instant photography camera. In 10 minutes, you could have your picture made. And these guys were standing outside of government offices throughout the country up until the early 90s. And of course, I saw this guy's camera. This was my first experience with this stuff. And I was completely fascinated with what they were doing. They looked at my 35mm camera and thought, what a technical marvel this camera is. And we started trying each other's cameras. I became buddies with these guys. And there's a picture here you noticed in the video of somebody with one of these old style cameras whose job was to go every day in front of the Ministry of Interior, and people who needed ID pictures, they'd have them made this way, and in 10 minutes you'd have a photograph done. And the image was photographed and became a paper negative and then re-photographed. And all the developing was done inside the camera. And if you look carefully at that photograph, you'll see a drawer where chemistry was put in. So the camera is working as a darkroom at the same time. But I was I am completely fascinated with all the Egyptian adaptations of photography, what they've done to make this medium their own. And that's one of them, yeah.
I understand why you're using the medium frame camera, 6x6 and all the rest of it. Wouldn't your job and your task be easier if you used a small Leica camera, like some of the famous black and white film cameras have done, Cartier-Bresson, etc.?
I did. I used a Leica for many years. I liked the 6x6 negative. It's if you're getting to be my age, you need glasses anyway. But it's just easier to handle, easier to work with, easier to print and develop. You can make nicer prints out of it. But I initially started working with a Contax, switched to a Leica for many, many years, and then moved on.
You're not interested in going up to step
When I have to return photographs to people, and the darkroom is 35 degrees, I wish that, I could just press print on my, but the attraction is for its ease of being able to return photographs to people.
Hi, I was just wondering, do you ever take any photographs at night? And if do, what sort of photographs would you take?
Yeah, I'm interested in parties, and I have lots of there were a couple here in the video. Flash and 6x6 are complicated to work with one. You have to use both hands. But yes, nightlife in Egypt is Egyptians live at night because of the weather. But flash is terribly obnoxious when you photograph people. You'll see some of the church photographs, and one of the most annoying things for me, and I'm absolutely certain for the people I photographed, is that I'm using this heavy flash while they're in service. Digital would be great in that respect, because digital sees better in darker situations. But Cairo is full of life at night, and I've not even come close.
Thank you. I'm curious how your American background has inflected your work, and have kind of a comment, which maybe you can comment or answer on if it's relevant. For me, I realized that it's something that seemed kind of quintessentially reminiscent of American literary tradition was kind of the specter of Walt Whitman. And I don't know if that's specifically this idea of kind of the genealogy of photography on the one hand, because of the era that started in, was something that was influential in his poetry, but specifically the idea of trying to capture kind of this what is beneath the veneer of the average everyday working man, working woman, presenting something which might be received by the audience, the contemporary audience, as unpleasant or ill-dignified, or but anyway. So to me, I wanted to comment that it seemed that your work was reminiscent to me of that kind of tradition.
Oh, thank you. I can tell you that I would never have been a photographer had I grown up in Iraq. It wouldn't have been possible. No way. The fact that I grew up in America allowed me to pursue something like this, and there would have been so much social pressure to become a doctor. That's exactly what I would have done, whether I liked it or not. Maybe I would have become a doctor and then did something else. But in the United States, I could do that.
Well, thank you very much. If you will allow me 1 minute, there are a couple of thanks I would like to say. First of all, for the Institute, the Research Institute NYU Abu Dhabi, for hosting this event and also the exhibition. Nils, who's walking around back there, has been an enormous help, and without him we wouldn't have achieved most of what we have. There's a special thank you also, I think, for Anthony Cardi, who printed the images in New York. A very fine job, I think. But most of all, I think both Yasser and I would like to thank Kerry Barrett, who unfortunately isn't here, who's in New York right now. She did more to put this exhibition together than almost anyone else. She did all the grind, she did all the lion's share of the work, and it's a great, great pity that she's not here. So, and above all, I hope you will join me in thanking Yasser Alwan for having